The cameras were rolling on The View when Whoopi Goldberg decided to make Toby Keith her target. It was 2023, and the veteran country star had just announced another leg of his tour, honoring military veterans and first responders. Whoopi leaned into the camera with that expression she reserves for people she truly wants to eviscerate. "Toby Keith," she said, letting his name hang in the air like an accusation. "He should be ashamed. Absolutely ashamed." The studio audience stirred. Her co-hosts exchanged glances, knowing exactly where this was headed. This man represents everything wrong with far-right extremism in this country. You know how many people actually show up to his concerts? Maybe 5,000 on a good night, and you know why? Because America is tired of conservative warmongering wrapped in a flag. The attack didn't stop there. For nearly 8 minutes of airtime, Whoopi laid into Keith's entire career. His support for military actions, his unabashed patriotism, his refusal to apologize for loving his country without qualification or nuance. She called him a relic, a propagandist, someone who profited from sending young Americans to die overseas. The other hosts nodded along, adding their own commentary about how real Americans were moving past this kind of nationalism, how Keith's brand of country music was dying, because it represented an America that never really existed. The segment went viral within hours. The clip was everywhere, dissected and celebrated in progressive media circles, held up as proof that the guardrails of acceptable discourse were finally being enforced. Toby Keith was performing a small acoustic set at a military hospital in Virginia when his manager showed him the video. He watched it once, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving the screen. Then he watched it again. The nurses and soldiers around him could see something shift in his expression. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more purposeful. He thanked everyone for their time, apologized for cutting the visit short, and made 3 phone calls before he even left the building. The first was to his tour manager. The second was to the mayor of Orlando. The third was to every veterans organization and military family network he'd built relationships with over 2 decades of USO tours and hospital visits. What happened next wasn't about retaliation. It was about demonstration. Within 72 hours, Toby Keith announced a free concert in Orlando, Florida. Not a small venue, not a ticketed event with corporate sponsors and VIP sections. A completely free open-air show in a public park with one single request: bring an American flag. The announcement spread through military communities, veteran networks, first responder groups, and family text chains like wildfire. No press release to major media outlets. No interviews with entertainment reporters. Just a simple post on his website and social media. Orlando, Friday night, free. Come as you are. Bring a flag if you've got one. The city of Orlando braced itself, not knowing what to expect. The park had a capacity of maybe 8,000 people if you packed them in tight. By Thursday afternoon, hotels within 30 miles were completely booked. RVs started arriving. Families drove from Tennessee, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama. Veterans chartered buses. Active duty military who could get leave made the trip. By Friday morning, the crowd estimates were already exceeding 20,000, and people were still coming. The local news helicopters captured footage that would later be used in documentaries about American populism. An endless sea of red, white, and blue stretching across the park, spilling into adjacent streets, filling every available space with flags. Of every size, from pocket-sized handheld versions to massive banners that required multiple people to hold. Toby Keith stood backstage watching the crowd assemble, and for the first time in his career, he felt something close to vindication and heartbreak mixing together. These weren't radicals or extremists. They were families with kids on their shoulders. They were elderly veterans in wheelchairs with purple hearts pinned to their jackets. They were young mothers holding photos of sons and daughters who'd never come home. They were firefighters still wearing their department shirts. They were police officers standing next to teachers standing next to construction workers standing next to nurses. The diversity Whoopi Goldberg claimed his audience lacked was right there, united not by politics in the partisan sense, but by something deeper and harder to dismiss. When he walked on stage, the roar was physical. It moved through the ground. He stood there for almost a minute, just taking it in, before he finally raised his hand for quiet. "I'm going to tell you something," he started, his voice cutting through the evening air with that Oklahoma drawl that carries authority without arrogance. 3 days ago, someone on television said I should be ashamed. Said you people don't exist. Said maybe 5,000 of you would show up if I was lucky. He paused, letting the crowd react, letting them understand what was happening. I count more than 5,000 just in this section right here. The cheers were deafening, but he waved them down again. This wasn't about dunking on Whoopi Goldberg. This was about something else entirely. She called me far right, called me an extremist, called me a warmonger. He shook his head slowly. But here's what she doesn't understand, and maybe what a lot of people in air-conditioned studios don't understand. Loving your country isn't extremism. Honoring the people who defend it isn't warmongering. And gathering together without shame to fly the flag your grandfather fought under, that your daughter serves under, that your neighbor died protecting. That's not far right, that's not far left, that's just being an American who gives a damn. What made the moment powerful wasn't the applause or the chanting or the flags waving overhead. It was the silence that came next. Toby Keith didn't launch into a song, he didn't make jokes or mock anyone. He just started talking, really talking about what he'd seen over 20 years of playing for troops. He talked about the 19-year-old kid in Kandahar who asked him to sign a guitar that he'd learned to play in a combat zone because it was the only thing that kept him sane. He talked about the Gold Star mother who told him that his music was the last thing her son had listened to before his convoy got hit. He talked about the Marine who'd lost both legs and still somehow made it to his concert in North Carolina because he wanted his daughter to see that losing part of yourself doesn't mean losing all of yourself. I don't need money from corporate executives to do this, he continued, his voice getting quieter but somehow carrying further. I don't need a single dollar from the Biden administration or any administration. I don't need permission from media critics who've never stood in a hangar at 3 a.m. watching flag-draped coffins come home. What I need is already here. You're here. That's all that matters. That's all that's ever mattered. The crowd wasn't just listening anymore. They were experiencing something they hadn't quite expected. This wasn't a political rally. It wasn't anger, disguised as patriotism. It was grief and pride existing simultaneously, the way they do in any country that's actually worth defending. People were crying, not because they were told to, not because some emotional manipulation was at play, but because someone was finally saying what they'd felt for years and couldn't articulate. That loving your country doesn't mean thinking it's perfect. That honoring sacrifice doesn't mean glorifying war. That being proud of the flag doesn't make you blind to injustice. It just means you believe the ideals are worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth gathering 35,000 strong in an Orlando park to defend. He played for 3 hours, every military tribute song he'd ever written, every anthem about small-town values and big-hearted people, but he also played songs about loss, about questioning, about the cost of service. When he finally played Courtesy of the Red, White and Blue, the song that critics had called jingoistic propaganda for 2 decades, it landed differently than it ever had before, because it wasn't being performed in defiance of criticism. It was being performed in the presence of the people who'd actually lived the reality behind the lyrics. The Gold Star families swaying, with their arms around each other. The amputee veterans singing every word. The active duty soldiers on leave who knew they'd be back in harm's way soon enough. They weren't celebrating violence. They were celebrating survival, resilience, the stubborn refusal to let sacrifice be meaningless. The media reaction was immediate and fractured. Progressive outlets either ignored the event entirely or downplayed the crowd size, publishing articles with headlines like Toby Keith's free concert draws expected right-wing crowd, or country stars Orlando rally raises questions about nationalism. They interviewed sociologists and political scientists who explained the dangerous populism of mass gatherings centered around national symbols. They quoted activists who called the event a dog whistle and a dangerous precedent. But they couldn't ignore the numbers. They couldn't dismiss the diversity of the crowd. They couldn't explain away the raw emotion that even their own footage captured. Whoopi Goldberg addressed it on The View the following week, but the confidence was gone. She said she stood by her criticism of Keith's politics, but acknowledged that clearly there are still people who connect with that message. It was the thinnest of walkbacks, the kind of statement that satisfies no one because it refuses to engage with the actual point. She never addressed the crowd size. She never acknowledged that she'd been factually wrong. She never considered that maybe, just maybe, her understanding of who loves this country and why was incomplete at best and arrogant at worst. But the impact of that Orlando night extended far beyond one television host's bruised ego. Veterans organizations reported record volunteer sign-ups in the weeks that followed. Military recruitment numbers, which had been declining, saw a small but notable uptick in several regions. More importantly, the event became a reference point, a moment people could point to when they were accused of being ashamed of America or told that patriotism was outdated. "Were you in Orlando?" became a question that carried weight in certain communities, a kind of cultural shorthand for standing up against the dismissal of deeply held values. Toby Keith never leveraged that moment for political gain. He didn't endorse candidates using the footage. He didn't turn it into a grievance tour or a brand. He just kept doing what he'd always done, playing for troops, visiting hospitals, showing up at veterans' funerals when the families asked. But something had shifted in how people understood his work. It wasn't about conservatism or liberalism anymore. It was about the difference between performing patriotism and embodying it, between talking about the troops and actually spending 2 decades of your life in their presence, learning their stories, carrying their grief, celebrating their victories. Years later, military historians and cultural critics would look back at that Orlando concert as a turning point, not in politics, but in the ongoing negotiation over who gets to define American identity. It was a reminder that the people waving flags in public parks aren't necessarily the enemy of progress or justice. They're often the same people running into burning buildings, serving in communities that others have abandoned, sacrificing comfort and safety for abstract ideals that intellectuals sometimes dismiss as outdated nationalism. The Orlando night proved that patriotism isn't a monolith. It's as diverse as the 35,000 people who showed up, and dismissing it, mocking it, trying to shame it out of existence doesn't make it go away. It just pushes it into spaces where it doesn't have to answer to critics anymore. Toby Keith never needed Whoopi Goldberg's approval. He never needed the validation of mainstream media or the blessing of political elites. What he needed was already in Orlando that night, standing shoulder to shoulder, holding flags their families had carried for generations, proving that the air-conditioned critics will always misunderstand the people who live with consequence rather than commentary. And in that misunderstanding, in that gap between perception and reality, something powerful happened. Not a political movement, but a moment of recognition, the kind that doesn't require permission, the kind that simply is.